Welcome to 6.5 types of errors. Today we're going to identify the two types of errors. We're going to see what causes them and interpret what happens when they occur. So let's first go over what a type 1 and type 2 error is. I do want to briefly say all of this that we are going to talk about is going to be conceptual. You're never going to really know if your null is true or false because, again, we are performing a significance test based on a sample. So we are just interpreting the result that we get. Because remember, from significance tests, you're making a decision. You're deciding whether you're rejecting or failing to reject. So that is where we're going to see, did I make a type 1 or did I make a type 2 error? So type 1 is a significance test makes a type 1 error when it rejects the null hypothesis, meaning it finds convincing evidence for the alternative, when the null is really true. So we reject the null even though it's true. So we make a type 1 error. And the probability of committing a type 1 error is our significance level, alpha. Now, type 2 error is going to be a significance test makes that error when it fails to reject the null hypothesis, which means it does not find convincing evidence for the alternative when the null is really false. So if you're ever asked to identify what type of error is being made, pay attention to, did they reject the null or did they fail to reject the null? And probability of committing a type 2 error, there may not be a second there, but it should be a type 2 error, is going to be beta, and we'll get to that in just a second. So again, if you are ever asked to identify the type of error, it's always going to be based on what was your decision. Did you reject or did you fail to reject? So let's organize our information in a little chart. So I have two possibilities. Either the null is true or the alternative is true. And I have two decisions. Either I rejected the null or I failed to reject the null. So let's get started with what happens when the null is true. So the null is true, however, we rejected it. Well, that's going to be our type 1 error, our alpha. Now, if the null is true and we fail to reject the null, meaning we say it's true, we're going to get a correct conclusion. And that's kind of boring because we just proved that whatever claim they made is true. So we just kind of backed up what they said. Now, what happens when the alternative is true and we reject the null hypothesis? Well, we made the correct decision, and that happens to be interesting because we're going against whatever the claim is, or we're disproving, or we are agreeing with the alternative claim. So correct, interesting. And when the alternative is true and we fail to reject the null, meaning we say that the null, there's convincing evidence that the null is true, we get a type 2 error, which is beta. Now, one thing I do want to briefly talk about is the concept of power and the power of a test. Well, the power of a test is the probability of rejecting a false null hypothesis. So that is going to be this square here, and that's going to be 1 minus my beta. So that's the probability of me correctly using a significance test to disprove a null hypothesis. So let's go ahead and go through an example. We have a potato chip producer and its main supplier agree that each shipment of potatoes must meet certain quality standards. If the producer determines that more than 8% of the potatoes in the shipment have blemishes, the truck will be sent away to get another load of potatoes from the supplier. Otherwise, the entire truckload will be used to make potato chips. So to make the decision, a supervisor will inspect a random sample of 500 potatoes from the shipment, and the producer will perform a significance test at the alpha equals 0.05 significance level of our null being the true proportion of potatoes with blemishes is 8%, or the alternative being the true proportion is greater than 8%. So that's what I defined my parameter as, and I'm going to describe a type 1 and type 2 error in this setting and give a possible consequence of each. So remember that a type 1 is when you are rejecting the null hypothesis. So a type 1 error in this case, and again, with anything in statistics, you want to put it into context. Don't just say, I rejected the null when it's true. They're not going to give you credit for that. You have to put it into the context of the question. So the producer finds convincing evidence that more than 8% of the potatoes in the shipment have blemishes when the true proportion really is 0.08. So finds convincing evidence means they rejected the null. True proportion really is 0.08 means that my null is true. So rejecting the null when it's true is a type 1 error. So a consequence of this could be the potato chip producer sends away the truckload of acceptable potatoes, wasting time and depriving the supplier of money. So again, a lot of this is just conceptual. What could possibly happen from this? Most of the time, there's really no absolute correct word for word, you must write this down answer. A lot of the time, they have some wiggle room with these questions where they'll accept different kinds of answers based on does it make sense? So for a type 2 error in this situation, I have the producer does not find convincing evidence that more than 8% of the potatoes in the shipment have blemishes when the true proportion is greater than 0.08. So does not find convincing evidence means they fail to reject the null hypothesis when the true proportion is greater than 0.08, meaning the null hypothesis was false. Anytime they make the decision to fail to reject the null, it is a type 2 error. So a consequence of this one would be more potato chips are made with blemished potatoes, which may upset customers and lead to decreased sales. A lot of the time, they will end a question like this with who is the more hurt person in the situation. And you can argue either way. You can argue the potato chip manufacturer is going to lose a lot of money. Maybe they don't work with the potato supplier anymore. But you could also say, well, the potato supplier lost out on a complete load of potatoes that they're probably going to end up just getting rid of. And they lost money from the first batch. So again, support your arguments. Always put it in context. And this is something that should come relatively easy. Just remember, type 1 is when they reject the null. Type 2 is when they fail to reject.